for coming out this afternoon. My name is Sheldon Kamenecki. I'm the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences at UC Santa Cruz. And we are supporting this event along with my excellent department of psychology. And we're very excited to have Dr. Claude Steele, the EVC from UC Berkeley, with us to present a lecture on stereotype threats. And you'll be hearing from him in a few moments. At first, I'd like to mention that there will be a Q&A session after he has completed his lecture. And the way we're going to work it is we're going to ask you to put your questions on cards, and we'll hand out cards and little pencils to you that you can write on about a third of the way or a quarter of the way through his lecture. Any questions that you have, and there'll be student volunteers. The volunteers around, they can raise their hands. Okay. Hopefully they're here. And we will then pass them up to the front, and Cam Leeper, the chair of psychology, who will introduce our guest speaker, will also do the Q&A and handle the Q&A. And all the questions that will be addressed will be through the cards, and there will be only those questions. None of us have prepared any questions for Dr. Steele. So I'd just like to introduce our chancellor, George Blumenthal. He's the 10th chancellor at UC Santa Cruz. He first joined the campus in 1972 as a faculty member in astronomy and astrophysics. And he was named chancellor on September 19th, 2007, after serving as acting chancellor for 14 months. He and I overlap by just a few days. He started as acting chancellor. I started as dean here in July 2006. Dr. Blumenthal's era has been marked by a commitment to ensuring that the doors of opportunity at UC Santa Cruz are open to all. A few things that he's responsible for doing. The number of undergraduate students from underrepresented minorities has increased by 50% since Dr. Blumenthal took office. Nearly half of the entering class in 2013 received Pell Grants, the federal financial aid given to the neediest students, exceeding the UC average by a whopping 42%. And finally, the percentage of entering Frosh who are first generation college students and who will be the first in their family to earn a 4-year degree now consistently tops 40%. Dr. Blumenthal was also I should mention, the president of our faculty senate here at UC Santa Cruz and the statewide faculty senate. And without further ado, Dr. Blumenthal.
Thank you, Sheldon, and welcome to all of you. I'm so delighted to see a good crowd here today. This is going to be an important conversation with social psychologist Claude Steele. Professor Steele has worn multiple hats throughout his career, and I think many of you know that already. He is really one of the world's experts on racial and gender stereotypes and how they play out in the academic milieu. And he's also, by the way, the provost of University of California, Berkeley. Today we're going to hear about his own renowned research on stereotype threat. I want to really thank the UC Santa Cruz Black Experience team, who originally recommended that we invite Dr. Steele to come to Santa Cruz and speak to all of us. His research is very much relevant to the experience of African Americans and other marginalized community on this campus and on all other campuses as well. And I'm particularly grateful to the students who've come forward over the last year or so to talk about their experiences with microaggressions, their feelings of isolation, marginalization, and in some cases, threat. We know that stereotypes can affect grades and performance and exams, and they perpetuate racism, sexism, and injustice. So we need to understand those mechanisms if we're going to break them down and deal with them and eliminate them. So we have a lot of work to do. I also want to thank the Division of Social Sciences the psychology department, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, all of whom are co-sponsors of this event as well. So it is really wonderful to have one of the greats with us today. And now to introduce today's speaker, let me introduce Cam Leeper, who is the chair of our psychology department, and he will introduce Claude Steele. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Blumenthal and Dean Kamenecki. As chair of the psychology department, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Claude Steele. Many of our psychology students and faculty, including me, have been inspired and influenced by his pioneering work on stereotype threat. I imagine the same is true for many of you in the audience today. Allow me to offer a little biography about Dr. Steele. Claude Steele grew up in Illinois outside of Chicago at the height of the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 1960s. As a student at Hiram College in Ohio, he became increasingly interested in studying issues of racial equality, rights, and prejudice from a scientific perspective. He was inspired by the work of the African-American social psychologist Kenneth Clark, who conducted some of the first psychological studies on the impact of racial attitudes and prejudice on African-American children. Dr. Steele's doctoral dissertation at Ohio State University examined attitude measurement and attitude change. Over the years, Dr. Steele has held academic positions at several prestigious universities. Among them was Stanford University, where Dr. Steele was chair of the psychology department, director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, director of the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences, and the I. James Quillen Dean of the Graduate School of Education. In 2014, Dr. Steele was named Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, the Chief Academic Officer of UC Berkeley. In addition, he is professor in the Department of Psychology and the Graduate School of Education at Berkeley. In his research as a social psychologist, Dr. Steele has examined people's self-evaluations and how they cope with threats to their self-image and identities. His work has considered self-image threat, self-affirmation and its role in self-regulation, the academic underachievement of minority students, and the role of alcohol and drug use in self-regulation processes in social behavior. However, Dr. Steele is probably best known for his research on stereotype threat. Stereotype threat refers to the psychological threats that individuals may experience in evaluative situations in which there are negative stereotypes relevant to one's social identity. When such individuals think about their relevant social identity, such as their race or gender, in an academic assessment, their performance may be undermined. A recent meta-analysis averaging the effects of stereotype threat across 151 experimental studies pointing to a large average effect size. That indicates that stereotype threat can have a strong impact on people's behavior and performance. However, Dr. Steele's research also highlights successful interventions that can mitigate the impact of stereotype threat. His ideas and work are summarized in his recent book, Whistling Vivaldi, How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do, which is available right over here. And he's about to tell us more about this in his talk entitled Stereotype Threat, How It Affects Us and What We Can Do About It. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Claude Steele to the podium.
Well, thank you for those lovely, warm introductions. I'm happy to be here today. It's a little hot on my own campus for me, so I'm really happy to be here. And across this conversation, as it was described, which I hope it is, a conversation over the afternoon, we can talk about all kinds of things. My first focus is going to be to cover sort of the groundwork with regard to stereotype threat, get us warmed up on those concepts, oriented a little bit, and then what can we do about it? What are the things that accentuate it, strengthen it, make it a real, have effects that we don't like, and what can we institutions do about it, and how might we think about it? So that's where I'd like to go. I'll start, but as we get into that section, I hope it does break out into a vigorous give and take and questions and answers, because there are a lot of things that you guys know, and I want to hear what you think and know about these things as well. So I hope we'll have plenty of time for that. Okay, well, I think stereotype threat, and maybe more broadly, social identity threat, you can feel on the basis of some social identity, like one's age or region of the country or religion, you can feel under threat based on that identity without really being aware or even knowledgeable about what the stereotypes about that identity are. So social identity threat is a little bit broader than stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is something where you know a precise stereotype and you know how it could lead people to judge you in a given situation. That's a very focused thing. The social identity threat is a little bit broader. So I want to put both of those things on the table. But really, I'll begin with the story of origin. How did this idea develop, and how did we move it forward? And that will be my way of warming us up to what the concept is. It really began when I moved to the University of Michigan in the late 80s, and I was on a faculty committee. I've talked about this many times. And on that committee, for the retention and recruitment of minority students, there was a graph which graphed out the cumulative grade point averages of students at Michigan who graduated from Michigan as a function of the SAT scores they had when they entered Michigan. And what you generally see when you do that is that kids who enter Michigan with somewhat higher SAT scores tend to have a tiny bit higher GPAs than students who enter with lower SAT scores. That's probably not particularly surprising, but the surprising thing is that they had a line broken out of the total, a line broken out just for African American students at Michigan. And that was the interesting thing, really, that started the puzzle. It gave us the puzzle that eventually led to a concept like stereotype threat. What that line showed was that at every level of entering SAT score, all the way up, African American students were winding up with lower grades than other students with the same SAT score. So all the way up that continuum of SAT, there was this phenomenon of African American students with that SAT score getting lower grades than other students. And that really was a challenge to my assumptions about things. I thought if you got students equally prepared, as measured by an SAT score, why wouldn't they have the same grades as other students? What was causing that underperformance? Within a matter of weeks, we found that the same thing was true for women in advanced math courses at the University of Michigan. That if you arrayed their grades in those advanced math courses as a function of the SAT scores they had when they entered Michigan, you saw that at every level of SAT, math SAT, women were getting lower grades in those advanced math classes than were men. Wasn't so true in the entry-level courses, but it was true in the advanced level courses. And then, of course, we checked the literature and found that this was true everywhere, this underperformance phenomenon across the nation, from grade school, GPAs, if you did the same thing, if you arrayed them as a function of test scores, the group whose abilities were negatively stereotyped in the general population wound up with lower grades, lower levels of performance. And that was consistent. It was true in Harvard Law School, and it was true in Stanford Medical School, it was true in graduate school, it was true in high school. It's just very lawful feature of American life. Well known by psychometricians, people who develop tests, but not really very clearly interpreted. What would cause this underperformance to happen was never really grasped by men. It was just sort of a known phenomenon. So that's what made us think it was an important phenomenon, and something to try to figure out. I was working on very different things at the time, but this was just so interesting. I got together students, and we talked and colleagues, and we talked forever about this. I'll spare you a lot of really silly experiments that we did that didn't pan out at all, and you know, just didn't work and didn't show us anything. And get to the punchline was that eventually we wound up with this concept of stereotype threat, that at least some of this underperformance seemed to be driven by stereotype threat. I wouldn't claim all of it is driven by stereotype threat. There are other things that contribute to underperformance. Just downright prejudice and discrimination can contribute to underperformance based on some given identity. That could create a pattern of data that would be quite the same, where a group, equal skill level, is winding up with lower performance as measured in some quote objective way. That could reflect something like that. It could reflect cultural differences, a variety of things. But what our research, I think, over the years has revealed is that this pressure of the stereotype is a significant force in this phenomenon. So, what is, the definition of stereotype threat is very simple. It took forever to get there, but it's pretty simple. It's simply being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant. Just being in a situation where or you're doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant. At that moment, you know that you could be seen or judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. And if the thing that you're doing or the situation you're in is important to you, then the prospect or the possibility of being seen in terms of that negative stereotype is upsetting in the immediate situation. It's just downright distracting and upsetting. And it can deter you from wanting to be in that domain of life. It may push you out of that domain of life. I feel uncomfortable there. I feel a certain judgmental pressure, and I just don't want to be there. I want to be somewhere else. So in that way, this pressure, which can seem quite abstract, can become very, very important in our lives, affecting some of the most important decisions we make in life, where we want to live, who we want to be friends with, what career choices we make, how well we perform under certain circumstances. This kind of a pressure can begin to have, you can see that it has can have some very serious consequences. It isn't a magical thing. I think it's a cousin to just plain being worried about being judged in general. I've been using this example of my Aunt Ruby, who, when we, on Thanksgiving, she had a view of us, a stereotype of our family, which was that we made dishes that were like show-offy dishes for Thanksgiving dinner. And when we showed up, they were really, so that was her judgment of us. It was a global sweeping stereotype about our family. And there you are on Thanksgiving morning making your dish, and it's as if Aunt Ruby is right there in the room with you, should we put the marshmallows on the sweet potatoes or not? How will Ruby see this? So it's having its effect. The difference between stereotype threat is that it's not just a view that Aunt Ruby has a view. It's a view that everybody in your society has a view. And when you're in a circumstance where that behavior of which that stereotype is about, where that behavior is going on, you could be seen that way. And you don't know whether you are being seen that way, but you could be seen that way. So it puts you in a certain vigilant mode. And a certain amount of our cognitive resources, our emotional resources, have to be dedicated to dealing with that vigilance and keeping that vigilance up. It's not cost-free to be under that threat. It is going to absorb some resources that will not be available for use in other domains or use in other ways. A certain amount of it has to be dedicated to vigilance in a situation. I've been using the metaphor of it's kind of like a snake in the house. You come home, which has happened to me, and somebody says, there's a snake in the house. Really? Is it a big snake? Is it a little snake? When we lived in New York, a dangerous, highly poisonous snake got out of its cage in the Bronx Zoo. And I think everybody in New York was just terrified, looking around every corner for this snake. He was eventually found, a little baby snake, in the same cage that he'd escaped from. So it didn't turn out to be a real threat. But that's kind of what it's like. You don't really know what it is. And since you don't know, you're in a situation where you have to kind of allocate some attention to it. And you have to read cues. What do the cues mean? What's the circumstance? To sort through that problem. I rushed over here and I forgot to bring my computer, and on my computer were 2 clips. I think they're cute clips, but this crowd has probably seen the clips that I was going to show. One of which is from the blue-eyed and brown-eyed experiment. I'm sure everybody, a lot of people, certainly in psychology, have seen that. That's an experiment which begins to show how having one's identity under suspicion could start to have some effects on one's cognitive academic function. The experiment that was done was by, I think her name was Jane Elliott in Riceville, Iowa. And the first one she did was the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and she wanted to show her classroom what his life was about. And so she stayed up all night and she sewed and ironed collars. And the collars were either brown or blue. And the next day she came into school and she had the blue-eyed kids put on the blue collars. And she stood in front of the classroom and she stigmatized them based on being blue-eyed people. And she said horrible things that you could never do in an experiment today, thank goodness. Blue-eyed people are not good people, they're not smart people, they don't smell good. And I think blue-eyed people should get up and move to the back of the classroom. And in the other renditions of this, the other depictions of this, the reenactments of this, you see the shock on these kids' faces hearing their beloved teachers say this about them, and they're devastated. They're at recess, they're not able, they hover together on the playground, and it's extremely distressing experience. The next day, the only justice in this experiment is that she does the same thing she'd done to the blue-eyed kids, she does to the brown-eyed kids, and she does it in precisely the way. I made a mistake. It is the brown-eyed people who are not good people and not smart people. And you get precisely the same reaction. In this film, some of you may remember, there's a section where she's over to the side taking a smaller group of students through a problem deck. And she's timing them. How fast can they get through the problem deck? And what you see is that when they have the collar on and have been stigmatized that day, it's taking them like twice, almost 3 times longer to get through the problem deck. This might be seen as an opportunity to dispel the stigma about blue-eyed people and really prove that they can get through the problem deck faster. No, it completely. And she asked them, well, what is it? Why are you going so slow today? And they start tugging on their collars. It's as if that is a part of what their consciousness is allocated to. What does this mean in this situation? Very poignant picture. So now, that raises the question: does the stereotype threat go to school? Could it have the kinds of effects on cognitive performance that would make it important? And of course, that's a very heavy-handed experimental manipulation that I just described, that Jane Elliott executed there. And that won't answer the question of whether or not in school, under relatively normal circumstances, where you haven't beat the person over the head with their identity and the stigma attached to it, just whether under relatively ordinary circumstances, a stereotype about your abilities could have an effect on your performance. So that is where our research picks up. And I'm going to pick it up at some of the experiments that began to be focused expressly on stereotype threat and not give you all those years of distracting experiments focused on other things. The very first one we did was a very straightforward experiment, women in math at the University of Michigan, and we got women and men who were really, really good at math, and we brought them in one at a time into the laboratory, and we gave them a very difficult half-hour section of the graduate record exam you take if you're a math major, not the general quantitative section. Hard, frustrating test. And our reasoning was that if stereotype threat was a factor, could be a factor in performance on a test like that, then we should start to see that this experience would be a very different experience for women than it would be for men. For men, as they sit down to take this test, they care about math. Now, all of the participants are selected for caring about math. They sit down to take this test. It's hard. It's frustrating. It's a little bit beyond their level. Men might begin to have some questions about themselves, their abilities, maybe feel a little bit anxious and so on. But in addition to that, women would have another weight in that situation, which is maybe my frustration here means that I'm confirming, I'm fitting into what they say about women in our math ability, that I've met my Waterloo, I've kind of met my limits here, and that's what I'm experiencing in this situation. Because that stereotype is out there available to interpret one's personal experience, this is a situation that should bring it in as a possible interpretation of what's going on in this situation. And that would be because these women really care a lot about math. That would be a distracting and an upsetting situation, and their performance should go way down. And their performance did go down. I mean, like way down, like a full standard deviation on this test. Of course, that wasn't, I talk about this in the book, we got that finding first, and we were kind of happy like sad as people, because you didn't want to see this happen. But as scientists, we were sort of happy because we had captured in the laboratory what I just described as underperformance in the real courses at Michigan. So we thought, since we had it in the laboratory now, we can take it apart and figure out what drives it. And talking about this with our colleagues, the very first explanation they point to is the biological explanation that, look, Claude, all you've done is rediscover that there is a limit in women's math ability, and that when you give them a very difficult test, that's when that limit shows itself, and so that underperformance is just, sorry, man, but you don't have the goods. So this introduced a lot of tension in the lab. This was hard. This was a hard era. And it took us a long time. You can see what we had to do. We had to be able to do the experiment over again and take stereotype threat out of the test experience for women. Somehow take it out. And if you could take it out, and then their performance came up to match that of equally skilled men, then you'd know that it was stereotype threat that had indeed suppressed their performance. Just basic experimental logic. So we had to figure out a way, how could you give them a standardized test and get the stereotype threat out of there? And it took us a year to figure that out, and eventually we came to a very simple instruction, which was just before we did the experiment over again, just before they sat down to take the test, we said, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests. You might have heard that, but that's not true for the test you're taking today. The test you're taking today is a test on which women are always do just as well as men, and then, so all of a sudden the woman sits down, takes the test, experiences the frustration, and maybe for the first time there is not available to her a stereotype-based interpretation of that frustration. Because we've said this isn't, something about your gender is not driving your experience in this test. Nothing about that is driving your experience in this test. It may be that you're not as good in math as you thought, just the same kind of pressure that the men would feel in that experience, in that situation, but you wouldn't have this extra burden. And when we did that, the women performed just the same as the men, as equally skilled men. And whew, that was a huge relief, and really made us impressed that maybe this kind of, social, psychological dimension of experience could actually, because, I can hear my father as I talk throughout the book, my father saying, stereotypes, look, just overcome stereotypes. What kind of person is set back by a stereotype? And, I could just hear his endless lectures about how you were to persevere and so on. So that was a very strong alternative account of what should happen in a situation like this. But we found when you took that out, you eliminated this difference. And it was a big difference to eliminate. We immediately, Josh Aronson, who was an undergraduate here, as you know, and I think gave a graduation speech here a couple years ago. Yeah. He and I were now at Stanford, and we did a similar experiment in relation to African American students and the stereotypes about their abilities. I don't know if I need to go into detail because it takes a long time describing these experiments. We got basically the same thing. Under stereotype threat, when you didn't say anything and you allowed the participants, white and black, to think that this was a test of cognitive abilities. You didn't have to say anything because they assumed it was a test of cognitive abilities. African American students perform about a standard deviation lower than other students. Even though we carefully matched them for prior performance and grades and so on, they performed almost a standard deviation lower on this difficult, in this case, IQ test, a non-verbal IQ test, Raven's Progressive Matrices IQ test, which interestingly is about the same difference between blacks and whites IQ in the general population. So we had replicated in the experiment that difference. But when you presented that test, Raven's Progressive Matrices, it's a puzzle. It looks like a puzzle. You could represent it very compellingly as a puzzle. And so when you did represent it as a puzzle, and told them it had nothing to do with measuring cognitive abilities, it was just a puzzle. Go in there and do the best you can. It completely eliminated the difference between blacks and whites. That 15-point difference went away completely. Now, remember, we're carefully matching all the participants for their skill level coming into the experiment. So what I'm eliminating here is not gross mean differences between the two groups. I'm eliminating underperformance among people who really do have comparable skills and would otherwise show a decrement in performance. You take the stereotype threat out of the situation and you see that group's performance come up. That's what I'm focused on here. It's underperformance. But it can be quite a sizable difference in performance, as much as a standard deviation. Well, these were enough experiments to get people very interested in these outcomes, and so a lot of people have applied these things in a variety of incredibly interesting ways that I would never have imagined, and it's been a very interesting and gratifying experience to see this concept be so thoroughly researched in so many aspects of psychology. Again, I'm going to follow a storyline which gets us more toward what do we do about this and what kind of remedies are in place. So I'm not going to go into all of the many interesting issues there. I think probably if you want to know what does stereotype threat do to a person that interferes with their performance in, say, a standardized test or in a classroom situation, what's it do? It's like multitasking. You're doing a couple things at once, and one of them is really kind of an emotional thing. You're monitoring how people are responding to you based on who you are and your identity. And that's a very broad, open task that requires a lot of resources. And at the same time, you're trying to keep that out of consciousness. That's an effort too. So there isn't often a lot left over to pay attention to the task or the situation that's right in front of you. And when that becomes a chronic feature of life in certain circumstances, it's not just something that, unlike what my father believed, that you could disprove the stereotype and it would be done and out of your life. Obama, the African-American President of the United States, experienced this stereotype. The whole anger translator thing, there he is, the calm Obama, whistling Vivaldi, presenting himself in a very dignified way, but then behind him is that anger translator. I love that example because it shows how high you could go, and unlike, as I say, my father's viewpoint on these things, you would still be experiencing stereotypes. It's a situational thing. It's a situational thing. When you're in a situation where a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant and you care about what you're doing, then this threat could, you can experience it. One of the clips, the other clips I had was of Charles Blow, who is he's an African-American columnist for the New York Times. And he's talking to Bill Maher about the Trayvon Martin situation. And he's talking about how he feels when he's in public that he is under this vigilance, that he's being seen this way. And that if he sees a policeman, takes his hands out of his pockets and straightens up, and he regulates himself in relation to how he thinks he's being seen based on the sort of intersubjective assessment that he could be being seen in terms of this stereotype as a possible menacing African-American male. And that as distinguished as he is, out in the street, in the public, it's a common job he's got to do in order to function. So it becomes a condition of life. If you've ever been really young in a situation, you know that can become a condition of life. If you're getting older, you know that can become a condition of life. You know that you could be seen in terms of what people think about older people. And when you're in circumstances where that stereotype is relevant, you feel it. One of the things I like about stereotype threat is that everybody has it in some form or another. We have several of them. And so one way you can understand one group's stereotype threat is to understand your own stereotype threat. That will give you, through analogy, a good way of thinking about other stereotype threats. And there's not a group on Earth that doesn't have intense forms of stereotype threat. They usually do reflect our history. African-American stereotypes certainly do. Think about the white male stereotype and how powerful that can be in certain situations, especially interracial situations. The tension can be, we've done experiments on this, the tension can be incredibly intense in that situation, where any little mistake could cause me to be seen in terms of that stereotype about my group as possibly racist. Nobody wants to be seen that way. In modern life, that is a very negative way to be seen. It's very upsetting. You never forget it, and it has a huge effect on how we relate to each other. I'm not going to risk having that happen, and so I might even avoid situations altogether just to avoid that. So the different forms of stereotype threat that we're subjected to. Now, you can get, one of the chapters in the book I enjoyed writing the most was about definitive ways, clever ways people have devised to get out of it. So you can get on an airplane, like that character, that African-American woman I described, gets on an airplane, she's got all these pressures she feels in American institutions of higher education. She flies to Paris, and they see her very, very differently. The same stereotypes are just not there. And with a single plane trip, it's gone. This whole thing that is organizing her identity in this situation is gone over there. So, of course, it's a huge expatriate community over there for African Americans for the last 100 years or so. And because it gives you a freedom for that. She says, this is an interview with Ira Glass on that lovely Saturday radio show. And he says, but they'll never let you be French. She says, I know they'll never let me be French, but I thank every day that they let me stay. So it's just getting rid of this whole apparatus is such a relief. Okay. What makes it strong? As a psychologist, we first thought there must be something like, a lack of confidence or low self-expectations or low view of one's group even. But what was presenting itself to us all along in the data were the fact that stereotype threat was much stronger for people in the group who were invested and very good at the domain where the stereotype applied. What made you vulnerable to stereotype threat, interestingly, tragically, is that you care about performing well in the domain where your group is negatively stereotyped. One other clip I like a lot is the first few minutes of the movie 8 Mile, which is about Eminem, the white rapper. And it shows him going on stage in Detroit with this completely black audience trying to rap, which is a black thing. And people are telling him you're white with a mic, which is like saying you're horrible. And so he's being exposed to all these, just pounded with these stereotypes about his inadequacy, and he can't rap, he can't say anything. His turn comes and he has to hand the mic and go off the stage. And the rest of the movie is how he deals with that stereotype, in that, because he does love it, and as we know, he's really, 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 really good at it. But he has to get through that in order to perform effectively. What seems to make it powerful are the elements of the situation that suggest to you that you could be seen in terms of that stereotype. I think it's like really simple, like really bone simple. You walk into a situation and some part of your brain is reading, picks up. I used to go hear my son, who was a jazz musician at the time, and I'd go to a club and I'd just be sitting there and I'd just find myself thinking, oh, how many other gray-haired people out there? And, there's one. And, what difference did that make? Why would I be counting in that situation? Well, you're just trying to get a read on yourself and whether this identity means anything in here. And what does it mean about me in general, that I'm still in rooms like this, And, I mean, there are all kinds of things that come up, but you're reading cues. I enjoyed the story of Sandra Day O'Connor on the Supreme Court. When she was alone in the court, she described the experience as being asphyxiating. But when Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined the court, within a very short period of time, she felt normal. They relaxed. It was like no problem. She leaves the Supreme Court, and after a little while, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now alone on the court, feels really under a great deal of pressure and says, I don't want it to be an abnormal thing that a woman is on the Supreme Court. Now, we fixed that. But that's how critical mass, and who else is in the environment, can make a considerable psychological effect on the experience of being in an environment. We do count, we do sort of assess what an identity means in an environment, and so on. So I think that's one of the important things to begin to talk about remedies about. That we often think that the sole problem comes from prejudice, either unconscious or conscious, but it comes from that. And I think, while I don't want to diminish the importance of that at all, I do want to stress that I think something else is often going on. And that is that there are cues in a situation, the way a situation is organized, the way the situation is composed, the ideologies that are present in the situation can all be cues that can really make a person feel under a spotlight about their identities. I can just give you a couple of quick examples. I remember doing an intervention at the University of Michigan around stereotype threat issues, and we adults came in. This was a wing of the huge dormitory there, 250 students, and they were going to be in this living and learning environment, and we came in and we said all these amazingly beautiful things about diversity, the value of it, and I mean, this was like up-to-date, perfectly tuned message, and they kind of listened and so on. But then a couple of weeks went by, and the fraternities and sororities started to rush, and all of a sudden, all the white kids in the cafeteria left. Black kids were behind. They left to do their rushing. And then about 2 weeks later, the exact opposite happened. All the black kids left, and they did their rushing in their fraternities and sororities, and all the white kids were left behind in the cafeteria. So now all of the things that we said about the value of diversity and so on were interesting and good thoughts and nice ideas, but down on the ground there were cues. There were elements of how that situation was organized that told you race was still going to be profoundly important in your life. In your life. How your life is going to be organized is, don't forget it, it's still going to be organized that way. And that's how I think it works. The way a situation is organized. That's the way segregation works. You segregate groups, and that tells you that that identity is extremely important and significant. It's going to structure your opportunities and the nature of your experience in the environment. It's just a huge cue that can override the best stated intentions. And I think that's some of the challenge, obviously, that we have in higher education. Another element of the composition is who's in leadership positions. How is the situation composed? Who's in it? Those are cues which have considerable significance with regard to whether this identity is going to be cool in this situation or maybe not so cool in this situation. Ideologies that are afoot. Ideologies about abilities, let's say. You certainly know, as I think everybody does it by now, the sort of interesting and amazing work by Carol Dweck on mindsets and whether or not abilities are thought of as fixed and kind of genetically given a certain amount, or whether they're thought of as expandable things that yield to experience and grow with experience. If your group, for example, is negatively stereotyped in an area, and you also have the ideology that abilities are kind of genetically shaped and limiting, let's be real. That kind of ideology about the nature of ability, and you go into that domain and you have your first setback or frustration, you could just very logically, without even a lot of emotion necessarily, you could just say, this is not for me. This is my group, this is not me. I don't do this. So I'm going to go over here. So there's a combination, again, where the elements of the situation combined with the ideologies and the general understandings that are afoot in the situation can have a great shape on how comfortable identities feel participating in the situation. Another ideology is, of course, about diversity itself. Is it something that's just marginal and a concession to past and probably exaggerated inequalities, or is it something that's actually integral to the quality of our functioning and to the quality of our experience as individuals? I believe the quality of science is tremendously facilitated by diversity. I've seen it happen in my field of psychology. Marty and I were in it before there were very many women in it at all, and we know how much it has changed as a function of women being in it. The perspectives, the problems, the issues, even the methods, everything has been expanded by people with different interests, different perspectives coming in with different ideas. And so diversity is very integral. I think it's one of the main resources of American culture is the fact that this culture, maybe above all else, has had a tremendously diverse supply of people. So, now, this suggests that in situations where the structure of the situation is raising these kinds of identity threats and putting people in these kinds of situations, the very structure of it, what can we do to facilitate that? Well, there are, I think, I'm going to just put them in general categories and maybe give some examples, and then we can start asking questions, because I see I'm probably running on a bit long, and their questions are accumulating. So, we can do things that really affect the environment. I mean, I do think critical mass is a huge thing. We've done a lot of research on that, and critical mass is important. You have to work on that kind of constantly, because we do count. Even when we don't want to count, we count. And so we want to do that. And diversity is a good thing, but you also need to see a little bit of your own identity to have a sense that this identity is not itself going to be a major problem in this situation. And that's a calculation which happens at a kind of semi-conscious level, an assessment which happens at a semi-conscious. Sometimes it gets conscious, but oftentimes it's experienced more as a sense of comfort and relaxation, not being vigilant in the situation. So critical mass is usually important. Role models, existence proofs. Living in a country where an African American can be the president of the United States is a lot different than living in a country where an African American cannot be president of the United States. And the same can be said, of course, in this moment about women. That's why it's important. It's because You want to live in a country where that's a possibility. If that's not a possibility, that makes that identity more important in ways that you don't want it to be important. So all of those things, role models, existence proofs, critical mass, dealing with the ideologies in a situation. I think using mindset, for example, the work of Carol Webb is extremely helpful in these same situations, reducing the sense of threat. There are some really cool experiments which take the other approach, the more psychological approach, which try to inject an interpretation into me, the person, that leads me to be either more understanding of the situation, I'd like to think of it that way, but that relaxes the degree to which I see threat in the situation. I'll give you an example. This is done by Greg Walton and Jeff Cohen, who live on the other side of the mountain. And this was done when they were at Yale, and some of you may be familiar with this research. I'll describe it and then I'll kind of stop. They got freshmen, black and white students who were freshmen, and they gave them information that had come from a student, an African-American student, who was about 18 months ahead of them at Yale. And I'm going to tell you in a narrative what the information was that they gave the participants. They did it in a variety of ways in different renditions of this experiment, but I'll just give you the narrative. The narrative goes something like this. The kid who's a little bit older, 18 months ahead of the freshman, says, basically, when I came to Yale, I really felt miserable. You know, the gargoyles, the architecture. How could I ever belong in a place like this? I went home on the weekends. Eventually, my father gets tired of me coming home on the weekends. He says, go back and, you know, you got an opportunity, make the best of it. He goes back, he and his roommate form a singing group. There's tons of singing groups at Yale. And they are invited to different department colloquia. And they go to the colloquium, and they're going to sing afterwards, but they actually see the colloquium, and he says, you know, I was just amazed. It was so interesting. I went to one in sociology, and I just thought it was fascinating. And then I went to one in biology, and I couldn't believe how interesting it was. And now I've taken a couple of biology courses, and I could see this could be an area that I really want to spend my life in. I love this work. This is really fascinating to me. And isn't it amazing that Yale has these kind of so many opportunities, so many things you can do like this, and you can see his narrative now has shifted to having a different focus. And then that's kind of the end of the information they give them. Well, for African American students, for white students, it just doesn't have much effect. It doesn't hurt anybody, but it doesn't have too much of an effect. But for African American students, immediately their grade averages go up by 1/3 of a letter grade. And by the time they are finished at Yale, their last year at Yale, there's virtually no underperformance of the sort that I'm talking about. So I like to end on this, but bring it full circle. That little experience in the lab had this very far-reaching in time effect of nearly eliminating underperformance. And there's a family of interventions like this. And how could that happen? It's almost magical. The best account is that the whole underperformance thing is a process. It's a recursive process. I come in, I feel vigilant and under some threat, like that kid in the story in the narrative is describing. I don't do as well as I thought I was going to do. I get even more vigilant. I allocate even more of my energies and thought to how is my identity functioning in this environment. I have less of it to allocate to the task, to getting involved in the task at hand. I don't do as well again, and I get even more vigilant, and you get this very recursive negative process. The positive recursive process is that, and this I think we've all experienced in our lives too, where you come in and this narrative kind of relaxes me a little bit. And I don't feel quite as vigilant. Look what happened to him. He's just like me. He kind of loves it. So I relax. I get a little bit more involved. Getting a little bit more involved, I perform better. I relax even more. Pretty soon my involvement is pretty intense and uninhibited or unfiltered through this sense of threat, and my performance keeps going up like that, and I have a very different experience of the same situation. So I love these data, because it does show that this whole phenomenon of underperformance, this whole phenomenon is accessible through pretty reasonable, manageable kinds of interventions. I could give you other examples of that, maybe in the question and answers, that it would be worthwhile. But I like that one because it shows that an intervention can get us all the way to the point of virtually eliminating the underperformance I started with. So I will stop at this point, and we'll just start opening up the conversation.
Oh, there we go. So first of all, in several of the cards, people just comment that they really appreciate you being here.
Oh,
Thank
well,
you.
great.
So one question is, how does the imposter syndrome intersect with stereotype threat? And how as an academic, do we use this information to support underserved students?
The imposter syndrome. So that's where I'm feeling like I'm faking it here, and I'm kind of holding up that. I think I haven't thought a lot about that. It's an interesting question, but I think it's almost like an adaptation to stereotype threat. If the stereotype threat wasn't there, if you weren't under the gaze or the potential gaze of the stereotype threat, you might not feel like you had to think about that kind of thing at all. The whole notion of thinking about whether you belong or whether you're an imposter in this situation just might not come up at all. I mean, so that's the first association I have to it. But they both can be adaptations to this situation of being under either a broad social identity threat or a very specific form of stereotype threat.
Here's one. You touched on some awesome points. I'm a junior here at UCSC, and I'm finding that I'm unable to avoid stereotype threat as it relates to the intersection of race and gender. I am a black female, and my intelligence and vitality are constantly being undermined by my professors with comments such as, "Wow, you are so articulate, I'm impressed. What can I do? Please advise."
Oh, boy. I wish I could see who wrote that. And just talk directly to that person. I mean, I do think that that's one of the main challenges. The first thing I want to say is how much I empathize with her, how much I feel I've been in precisely that kind of situation. And when I think about myself going through those kind of situations, I do talk about it in one of the chapters in the book about being in graduate school and feeling, I didn't have the term for it at the time, but feeling under a lot of stereotype threats, so much so that my personality was sort of in lockdown, and I didn't raise my hand in class because I was so fearful that if I didn't get it exactly right, or if my South Side of Chicago dialect were to leak through, I would be seen in a certain way that in that situation, because it was all about who was really smart and who was really good and all, that I would just be kicked out the door, you know. So I do talk about that, and I talk about my own experience of sort of growing through this. I think everybody has their own version of this experience to contend with. First, I want to offer optimism, even though it can be an intense pressure in an era of one's life, in a particular circumstance. It can pass. It can relax a little bit. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't reemerge at some point. It doesn't mean that when I wasn't a full professor, some years later, and yeah, I'm the chairman of the psychology department, but I walked across the hall into the history department. They don't know who you are, and they could think you're an affirmative action baby or something. It's situational. It's situational. You do, though, work through yourself into a situation often where it's not plausible that you're being seen that way. you know, people get familiar with you, they know who you are, oftentimes I think that's why we're very good at crossing these identity barriers in friendships, where we get to know each other, because friendship is about trusting that you're not going to go there. I would never think this person would ever go there. So working through a college experience, a university experience like this, I do think there will be opportunities where you do get to know people. I think the more the more outgoing you can be, the more exploring you can be, and the more you can say to yourself, it's just stereotype threat. There was a group of students at Stanford that had, in reaction to this exact same challenge, they had red T-shirts, and the sentence on the T-shirts were, "It's just stereotype threat." I think knowing about it, knowing that that's a good part of what the phenomenon is, can help a person relax a little bit and allocate one's resources in other ways. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And as you relax, you know, people pick up on that. And you have different kinds of interactions with people. Your performance often goes up a little bit, or your participation. In my case, my participation went up a little bit. And then once it went up a little bit, and I could see that it wasn't, my worst fears weren't going to really happen to me, then I relaxed a little bit more. Maybe that's how I've grown into being this obnoxious self. I don't know, but you do kind of deal with it that way, and I do want to stress that I think a lot of people have this kind of challenge in a lot of circumstances that are very important to them. Think about the white guy who wants to make it in the NBA. Just think about that. And the stereotype threat that person is going to be under on every step of the way through all the steps you have to go through to get into the NBA. Coaches from when he's in the 6th and 7th and 8th grade all the way to coaches in the pros, and when he's in, you know, it's a similar thing.
I think you kind of alluded to this a moment ago, but a few people have asked, does learning about stereotype threat help reduce its impact?
Yeah, I just having made that point, I'll just underline that point. Yes, the answer is indeed, I think it can be very helpful.
And then we have a few people asking questions about, can you comment on the impact of positive stereotypes about a group? For example, the model minority for Asian Americans.
Well, in certain circumstances, being positive, under a positive stereotype about your group can be helpful. For example, I think it leads, I have given this example of myself in basketball as an African American male. I'm extremely mediocre at basketball, and in fact that might be a euphemism for how I play basketball. But because my group is positively stereotyped in that domain, this is what we do. And I grew up on the south side of Chicago, that's what we do. So it didn't really occur to me that my frustrations in that domain should be a signal that I should get out of the domain. And I think it had to do with the fact that my group belongs in this domain. And so I think there was a definite margin of protection in that way because my group was positively stereotyped in that way. On the other hand, I think in different kind of circumstances, you can see positive stereotypes being a real pressure when you feel you have to live up to them. You know, like being the African American who can't dance and is at the dance. And people are going to expect something that you know you can't deliver. That would be a pressure. So that kind of thing happens too. I mean, there's a lot of interaction that goes on between this, it's almost like a cloud of social representations and us as individuals that are the mechanism by which we regulate ourselves.
We have a few questions asking about critical mass. So here's one. If you're less than 1% of the population, how can we deal with stereotype threat without critical mass?
If you need more critical mass. That's the first thing. But there are other things to do. Because I've been in situations where I think in much of my professional life has been in situations where there wasn't much critical mass. So I'm familiar with that. It's not all defeating. That's the first thing I want to say about stereotype threat, is that while I'm up here arguing towards being an important factor in our lives, and a powerful factor, it's not all defeating, and sometimes there are even ironic effects that are rather positive. I can get to that later. But I wouldn't want to leave with the impression that an intense critical mass challenge is itself sufficient to derail a person's experience in that environment. That there are other strategies, some of which I've talked about here, that shape one's interpretation of what's going on in that situation, that relieve some degree the pressure that you might feel in a situation like that. I just give again my experience of going to graduate school and having a relationship with my advisor after about a year and a half, having a good relationship there. In that one relationship, I felt like he didn't see me stereotyping. I felt safe. And in fact, he took me seriously. So I was the only African American in all of the social science graduate program back in but the fact that he took me seriously, and I had a genuine relationship there, made me feel in that relationship, I loved that relationship. I worked really hard to perform for that, and he could see that, and it built up a very positive connection that I felt safe. I didn't feel like I was being seen stereotypically. Again, if I went down the hall, there were professors using the N-word in those days, and I mean, there were all kinds of things going on that made you know your identity was a big deal. There was nobody in the field other than Kenneth Clark, who I'd never met, who was African American, so there wasn't a lot of role models, there wasn't a lot of critical mass, but just in the basic relationship between people, which I learned to build those relationships and to make and to put my trust in them, because they helped me relax and live a happier and more effective life in a situation. I think I learned that there.
So a few questions kind of try to get at how the social context might moderate the impact of stereotype threat. So one of them was asking you about what, say, negative stereotypes about African Americans, how they might impact students at a historically black college versus maybe a majority white college.
Well, it's interesting that if you look at historically black colleges and universities educate about 17–18% of African American college students today. That's all. But they educate about almost 70% of all of those who go into quantitatively based fields, even professions like medicine and so on. So it seems that in those schools are not getting kids who come in with the strongest preparation compared to Berkeley or Stanford or something like that, or Santa Cruz, UCs in general. I would have to conclude from that general pattern of data, I have to take that seriously and wonder, at least, that those environments might have a little less stereotype threat pressure around around some STEM fields, because they seem to do so much better at that. Now there are other things about those schools. They're a lot more often focused on the undergraduates, the caring and supporting of undergraduates. Xavier is probably the best example of that. I think they produce every year about 4 times more beginning medical school students, African American medical school students, than the next university, like Howard, 4 times more. But it's an extremely challenging, supportive Jesuit school that focuses an awful lot on supporting students, and they're very successful in that. So anyway, I do think stereotype threat is a huge factor when you combine eliteness, high selectivity, low critical mass. You start to pile up the factors that intensify stereotype threat.
Is there a direct correlation between stereotype threat and self-confidence?
I've always been resistant of that idea. I can't claim to be objective. as an African American social psychologist, as much as I admired Kenneth Clark, one of the legacies he left was, how do you explain the experience of being stigmatized and prejudiced against? And sort of the standard operating explanation for much of the 20th century applied to African Americans, to Jews, to women, was that you kind of internalize the stereotype. And having internalized it, you self-fulfill it. And that was the standing kind of account of what happens. And you can see stereotype threat is fashioned in a different way. You're dealing with a real situation. You're dealing with potential judgment of yourself based on the stereotype. And and you feel that way because of cues in the situation to make you feel that way. That's a very different thing than believing I just walk along, I hear the stereotypes, so I see and hear, and I internalize it, I kind of believe it about myself, and I fulfill those negative stereotypes. Actually, the person, Freud made a lot out of this, but interestingly, it was W.E.B. Du Bois who first thought that up in his book at the end of the 19th century called Philadelphia Negro. You'll see him come to a kind of internalization interpretation of the Philadelphia Negro. So I haven't liked that because I don't think it's right. So in terms of the self-confidence question, I don't know if stereotype. I think about myself in graduate school where again I had certainly an intense dose of it around intellectual ability and so on. Certainly it raises the question, it keeps the question alive. But as long as you are still trying to achieve and function in it, I think for the most part you're resisting the internalization of it. When you finally give up and say, this is not for me, then I can internalize it. So I think there's that kind of a psychological process that goes on. So I don't think I think while it can keep your confidence under question, it doesn't lead to an internalization of necessarily of low confidence.
Okay, our last question is kind of a set of questions. Does your theory of stereotype threat focus mainly on the individual? What about those that perpetuate stereotypes? How can they be challenged?
Well, I don't think stereotype threat theory can do everything, but I do hope one of the things it does is to make people aware of the cost of stereotypes and the fact that they do have a presence in our lives, and in that way undermine and make people check their tendency to stereotype. So I would hope that the reasoning itself would be some contribution to undermining stereotypes. Stereotypes are difficult things to undermine because they're tied so much to our history and to just the way our society is arranged that they're difficult to undo. But I do know that I've lived through the demise of certain very challenging stereotypes. We probably all have seen stereotypes change over time. When I was a kid, it was sort of assumed that African Americans would not be really professional athletes. They didn't have the ice in their veins to be really professional athletes. So that was gone. Maybe there's still an issue in the quarterback position. That's a lingering issue there. But stereotypes do kind of fade in time. That they couldn't be leaders. I think Obama's done a lot to change some stereotypes. So I don't know if I'm giving a coherent answer. I may be unwinding up here at this point, but there's hope.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.